Hey YouTube, Awesome Rider here. Welcome to my review for the deluxe Ptera Freeze Megazord from Power Rangers Dino Fury. I don't know why, but I think it's really funny just introducing that with like Ptera Freeze Megazord, and then you have this little egg buddy here in the front. Anyway, as per usual with this review, I will be taking a look at this guy in comparison to his Ryusoulger counterpart in all of his main modes, including the Ultrazord mode, and in the case of this one, there's only one mode that we can't really do compared to the Japanese version, but I'll get into that later. Anyway, before we get started, let me just quickly show off a comparison of the key and what the key does in the Morpher. Alright. So here we have the comparison for the keys. Obviously there's a different approach here, as I've mentioned in past reviews, so it's almost unfair to compare. While they both work as a gimmick, Ryusoulger's priority was to be a gimmick and a Megazord thing at the same time, whereas especially with these keys, the priority is being the Megazord. Like you can see, this has that sort of clear outline of the key, whereas this looks more like the key itself. And then you have the little, helmet cover right over here for that. And then on the back here, you can see the differences in the head sculpt, and this one has the more well-rounded one to be ready for the Megazord formation and the articulation, whereas this one, again, is trying to be both. And this one obviously has the ability to do this, and this one really can't do that at all. I mean, you do have that there, so that's a thing. This can work in here, but it doesn't really do anything exciting or different. As with Gold's, it advertises working with this one, but all it really does is activate the same sounds. And on top of that, it doesn't have even that great of a non-reader. Like, see, like I just put it in there, did nothing. See? And sometimes it'll just do that. So it's really sensitive reader as is, so there's not really a whole lot of value to be found with the keys. Alright, now that that's out of the way, as I said here, we have our just little egg buddy mode here, and honestly this mode has grown on me over the years. It's not my absolute favorite, but honestly it's pretty adorable. It was pretty adorable in Ryusoulger if I recall, and it's fairly harmless. And if anything, I kind of appreciate how kind of unique it is, just because, we've seen so many of these types of mecha, and this is at least a unique take on it, especially with like the idea of the eggshell becoming the wings. I think that's pretty neat, and overall, I think works pretty well for what it is. The only thing that really sticks out is the little Lego ports here on the side, which you can use for kind of a fun little mode, which I honestly don't remember if they ever did in the show, but I think they had it in the instructions in the Ryusoulger version, which I'll show off in just a second. But let's go ahead and take a look at our first comparison. Alright, here we have it next to our Ryusoulger counterpart, and honestly, for me, they're nearly identical. I mean, there is definitely a difference. I don't know why I slipped into an accent there, but there's definitely a difference you could tell a little bit, but it's nothing too major. Like, honestly, primarily, the difference is it's a little bit of a darker blue here on the Ryusoulger one. It's got a little bit of a glossier feel to it, a little bit more of a high-quality plastic. The eyes are a little bit darker right here for the red, and then the gold is a little bit nicer of a shine for sure. And the egg here, like the egg shell, rests a little bit different. This one kind of is straight down, and this one goes up into a peak, and there's a little bit difference in the mechanism. But for the most part, at least for me personally, I don't think there's anything too huge to write home about. They're all relatively minor in my opinion. In fact, on this one, you actually have a little bit more details here. Before we transform it into its dino mode, let me just show you this like fun, quick little mode we got. So pull out the legs from here. And you have this fun little mode here, which is just kind of this adorable Humpty Dumpty mode. Again, I don't remember if they ever used it in Ryusoulger, but I remember it being in my original review, and I just wanted to show off you could do it again, and it's just kind of a fun little mode here. But now let's go ahead, I'm going to get him back in the egg mode so we can transform him into dino mode. Okay, we've got it back in egg mode now. Alright, there you have the dino mode, which overall looks pretty good. I would say it's my least favorite of the three. Like I said at the beginning, I do appreciate the creativity of like the eggshells becoming the wings, which is cool, but I think it results in this transformation, in my opinion, looking the messiest, especially in the toy form. Like you just kind of see all the odds and ends and the pieces, like the little fists sticking out and the weird feet down here and stuff like that, and it looks a little bit clunkier, and I feel like it doesn't flow together as smoothly as in regards to into a creature transformation, at least for me personally. The only like real complaint I have about this version over the Japanese one is the way you put these fists in up here. I don't know if you saw, it's that little sort of tube peg mechanism, which honestly is kind of hard to get into because you have to get just the right angle because it clashes with the other plastic on here. Not to mention it's not always a tight fit and they'll frequently flop off, as opposed to the Ryusoulger version, which uses a traditional sort of click peg, which is just a lot easier to deal with overall, and I just kind of find it to be needlessly confusing. But speaking of, let's go ahead and take a look at comparison. All right, here it is next to its Japanese counterpart. And I just wanted to show off too that, like, you know, I have the shield on down here for this one, but if you put it up here, like on this one, it'll have it leaning back a little farther, whereas this one can kind of lean forward. I mean, as you see, it's leaning forward this way, but it can be kind of a little bit more straightforward here, whereas this one's kind of angling up. I just wanted to show that difference with that. But again, I find these to be fairly comparable, if I'm being honest. I think the biggest difference, obviously, is in the head sculpts. I think the Japanese one probably looks a little overall better because you kind of have this thicker gold, like, visor thing here, and the eyes stand out with a little bit more. The beak can open on this one, and it's fairly easy to get. There's like a little hinge under here. That's the best part of the review. And this one over here doesn't have as thick a one. It almost looks like his cousin Ned, I don't know. You can also move the mouth, but it's like harder to open. There is this little flap under here, but it doesn't come up as freely, like it's a little bit more stiff, which I guess is kind of nice because maybe it won't get loose. But like with that one, it's very easy to pull the little clip and open the mouth, but then with this one, you just can't do it. And then obviously the same paint differences will be the same on the wings since it was the same on the eggshells. And you can see here that the symbol right here is colored in silver, whereas this one's not. But since it's not my favorite mode anyway, it's not too huge of a deal. There's definitely a more noticeable difference in this mode compared to the egg mode. Nothing life-changing. Honestly, for me, the biggest difference is I just prefer the way these arms click in and the mechanism's just a little bit better to deal with. There you have the Ptera Freeze Megazord. Overall, one of my personal favorite designs of the series. I think it's really nice that Mosa and this came out at the same time because I think they're my two favorite individual designs of the series. I think they both just look really great. And I think they did another really good job on this personally. There's definitely some differences between this and its Japanese counterpart with some of the color, some of the color distribution, which makes it look a little bit different. But for the most part, I think it's a really nice mold. And again, it kind of continues, yet again, what I like about these is I feel it fits a lot more the slender proportions of the show, not to mention the show accurate helmet. Not that the other one doesn't have accurate colors, but this one has that more rounded look, and the fact that you can actually pose it and whatnot, it just really adds to it, and it looks much more like the show, and the show does so many like dynamic poses and kind of emphasizes the more slender nature of the mech, and I think this mold really represents that well. After we do the comparison, I will go over the articulation here again in a minute. No loose joint problems or anything like that. I think it feels very solid. Just in case you haven't watched my previous ones, just to address this, because I know people have talked about some of the breakability of it. For me, I think they feel solid. They can be brittle if pushed too far, but it's honestly the same for Sentai mech. Look, I want to note something before I forget. Right here you can see where the wings click in both modes for this and the pterodactyl mode. See, they're kind of loose right now for the transformation. And then you click it in here so they're secure so they don't flop around. I do want to note in regards to fragility that this feels, it's a very tight fit, which is nice because it won't flop around and it doesn't feel like it's going to pop out, and it feels like a tighter port than the Japanese one. But these pieces do feel thin, and at times it does feel a little bit dangerous when you're trying to pop these out. So be careful. I would say if I had to predict anything that would break easily, it might be this. So definitely be careful with this. All right, now we can get to the comparison that's out of the way. I would say that this one has probably a more noticeable difference just looking at it compared to Gold's, but for me, it's nothing game-changing. I mean, you can see little details here, like, see the shield has the silver tips, and this one does not have silver tips. Also, I think on the box, I honestly don't recall if it's on the instructions, but on the box, it has the shield going the opposite way with these two prongs facing down. I mean, you can put it any way you want. The whole thing's customization, but I just wanted to note that. Important here for the crotch piece, it doesn't have this little white paint here. There's no paint here for that. Well, and what's kind of nice is, I don't know if you can tell, this does have a very similar kind of shiny pearly look to the white, which I think is a little bit more noticeable on the Ryusoulger version, but they both have it and you can see it on there, and I think that's really nice, and I think it makes it look a little bit better. This one almost comes off a little bit brighter white, maybe, which can be a little bit off-putting, and it makes it feel maybe slightly imbalanced compared to this one or something, but it's not a huge deal. But I do appreciate that it kind of has a little bit of that sparkly look to it, so it's not just like straight up basic white, which would make it look rather cheap. As per usual, one of the biggest differences for me comes in the head sculpt because they're not focused on the whole key aspect. You're able to get a much more well-rounded, accurate head, which looks just much more accurate to the show, which I really like, and that's probably my favorite major difference between the two. Other than obviously the articulation, and then of course another difference that I've brought up before is just in regards to the transformation mechanism. These ports are a little bit more difficult to deal with, although I have to say the ports on this and Gold seem to be a little bit easier to work with than the original primary Zords. With that being said though, the Lego gimmick and the transformation on the Ryusoulger stuff is much smoother overall, and I just thought I would note that. Okay, so for articulation, we pretty much got what we got on Gold. You know, you can move the arms around, whoops. You can move them, come clean off, and then you can go rocket arm. You can move the arms around here. You have a nice little hinge joint out here, so you can actually move them out there without taking them off. You have a nice elbow joint right here. You have a little bit of swiveling there. You have a nice little ball joint at the leg. Just kind of be careful, you might clash with this a little bit, but you have a nice joint at the leg like usual. You have a nice knee joint here. This one is a lot easier to deal with. Some nice swiveling here. And by saying a lot easier to deal with, I mean on Gold's, the knee joint was really tight, so I'd have to be like, and I was worried about breaking it. Did you hear that brilliant effect I just did? But this one's a lot easier to deal with. Nice ball joint here on the foot. Just like with Gold, the feet are separate when you get them and you have to finagle them on, but thankfully I think it's a pretty tight fit for that. You don't really have waist articulation, but this does move because of the way the transformation works. And then obviously the head and neck articulation I kind of showed off. You can move it 360 around and up and down, which gives a little bit of personality, but it's really nice. And in case you haven't watched other reviews, as I've mentioned in the previous Dino Fury Zord reviews, something I love about the posability is I think not only is it great to have a mech with some posable options, but this series in particular has some really dynamic looking Megazords, and it really helps represent that. Okay, now we have two modes that are going to be combined with the T-Rex Zord. One is just with the T-Rex Zord on his own, and then the other one is with the Warrior mode, and it's a transformation that we can almost get to, but not quite all the way. But let's go ahead and get to that. Alright, and here we have our mode combined with the main T-Rex, and which we can actually do because there's no pieces missing. It's overall a pretty neat looking mode. I'm going to just really quickly flash over to footage of the Japanese reviews so you can get an idea for that, because the differences primarily just amount to the same differences as you have with T-Rex's head. I think I like the Ryusoulger version a little bit more for this one. I think that the Ryusoulger head just pops a little bit more for that one for me, and just something about the way it flows overall is a little bit nicer. Not to mention, even though I love the articulated mold of these, I think that the non-articulated, kind of more solid mode of the Ryusoulger one allows it to stand a little bit easier and a little bit easier to deal with. But this one still looks pretty cool. I always dug the way that this makes it look like it has this cool ice, almost demonic mane. Now, there is a mode where you combine it with essentially these two, but in the Warrior mode, and you add in the Pachizord as gloves. Now, we can do that all except for the Pachizord. I'm going to go ahead and do it just to show it. Alright, so here you have this mode. Again, the Japanese version is basically exactly this, except you have Pocky boxing gloves. That looked anyway. But I'll just show some footage here for a second and you can kind of see what the difference is. So like, in this case, it's not like Gold Zord where you can't do the Ultrazord formation with Dimetro because it doesn't exist. I mean, you obviously, the Pachizord doesn't exist here for this, but you can still get it most of the way. And if I'm being honest, I actually kind of prefer it this way a little bit. It's not the most exciting, but I think that the Pocky gloves kind of clash. And I just want to point out it's nice you can at least almost get there, and there's a chance we'll never get the Pachizord, but I figured I'd show it off. And like, again, this is kind of a stepping stone to the final formation. Alright, and there you have the Ultrazord transformation. I have to say, first thing I wanted to bring up was working with the T-Rex Zord again for this review. Unless it's my imagination, I really do think they made some improvements to the peg system for Gold and Ptera in comparison to the old ones. They're still not overall as smooth to work with as the Ryusoulger ones, but the pegs on the new two Megazords honestly are so much easier to work with than T-Rexes. T-Rexes are still just too tight sometimes and honestly kind of a pain in the neck to deal with, and I have to give it props. I don't know, maybe it's my imagination, but I think they really did change him a little bit. I overall think this looks pretty good. I think it looks a little bit hodgepodgey and a little bit strange. Overall, I think pretty solid, and it pretty much works exactly the same way as the Japanese version. There's not really a whole lot of huge differences. The only real significant thing I can think of is the way the helmet works here. It's just this individual little piece that you saw me put on that you can like store with this and whatnot, or you can store it on the back with it. But in the Japanese version, it was part of the shield and you folded it up. It's actually kind of nice to have it as a separate piece because then you can actually still get some of the head articulation and stuff like that. Not to mention it's kind of weird when you have like this little front faceplate over it. It kind of looks like these two little layers, whereas this just looks like a regular helmet with a mask on, which I think is really nice. And again, being able to pose it with the head turn and stuff gives a little bit of personality. You're obviously going to have articulation with this thing still. It's going to be a little bit harder to work with just because it's a little bit heavier and stuff. And I noticed that these are a little bit taxing and heavy on the arms and stuff like that, and you're not going to be able to get as dynamic as opposed with something like this. But let's go ahead and compare it to its Japanese counterpart. Alright, so here we have the two next to each other. This one's obviously a little bit taller, as you can see there. I think this one's probably the most close to being accurate in terms of the proportions when you look at it in the show, because again, they're a little bit more posable and stuff like that. And I think the helmet probably looks overall a little more accurate. You can sort of see what I mean about it being kind of actual helmet on it, whereas for the Ryusoulger version, it's just kind of overlaying it, and you can't move either of them anyway. Although this one makes the helmet look a little bit more different than this one, which makes it look like just a different mask on it, which that's what it is. But this always has made it look a little bit more different even than in the show. One thing I'll say though is I still do like the altogether Ryusoulger version, and there's something that feels a little bit more impressive about it. Maybe because it's just making me think more about mech at the end of the year and like, look what I've built, and that's kind of what it looks like, and it looks a little bit more sturdy and impressive. But this one overall, like I said, I think looks the most accurate, but for some reason to me, neither one looks as accurate. Like when I'm comparing the individual modes, I can say I think the Dino Fury ones usually look more well-rounded and accurate, whereas this one, even though I would say that for this one, it just doesn't quite feel that way. But maybe that's just me. I think they're still overall have their pros and cons. I think for me, the biggest pro about the Ryusoulger one is just the ease of use and the transformation. It's just a lot easier to work with overall, especially when you have all of them together. Overall, for a final verdict for this guy, I'm still really happy with it. It's not perfect. I probably noticed more overall differences with this one than I do with Gold, but none of it's deal-breaking, and it's still one of my favorite designs, and I think it represents it really well. And I like having a version that's so posable and awesome. Not to mention you get lots of different combination options with this one, and probably the most concise ones, as you're not really missing out on a ton. Again, as far as like recommendations for considering this, just looking at it on its own, I can very easily recommend the US version to you individually. I think it's a very solid mech with a lot of pluses and improvements over the Ryusoulger one, with looking more show accurate and being posable. But if you're thinking about it in terms of collecting the whole line, it's definitely worth noting that it doesn't seem like we're going to be getting all the pieces for this, so you're going to be missing out on certain things like the Pocky gloves and other stuff. So it just depends on how you want to collect. But that's about it for this one though, guys. Until next time, like, comment, subscribe, and climb the steps, ring that bell so you get notifications for my videos. Dawson Ryder, signing out.